All right. So welcome everyone. Tonight we have with us Sarah Woolley from Outlier Research and Daphne from the Wolcott School, who are going to talk with us tonight about some adaptations and accommodations we can make in our mobile CSP lessons for students who have different kinds of learning differences. I'll let Sarah and Daphne introduce themselves a little bit more here.
Great. Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm an education researcher at Outlier Research and Evaluation, and I'm part of a research practice partnership group with Daphne Sejus-Brady and some of our colleagues, who I'll tell you about briefly when we start our presentation. But thanks for having us. We're happy to be here.
So hi, I'm Daphne Sejus-Brady. I'm Director of Student Services at the Wolcott School. So I help work with teachers to modify curriculum to support students with varying learning needs. And so I'm happy to be here, and I'll talk more later.
Thank you. So Sarah, you know how to share your screen and start the slide deck then?
Yep, so I'm gonna try that out right now. And
Wonderful.
Here we go. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen. Daphne might have already introduced ourselves, so I'm just gonna move along here. As I said, she and I are both part of it's an interdisciplinary research practice partnership. And we are fortunate enough to be on a team with many other people who are engaged in some work with us. And so our team includes, we have education researchers, special education and learning strategy specialists, teachers, school psychologists, curriculum writers, and high school students who learn differently. And we've been working collaboratively really for the last kind of 2.5 years on a National Science Foundation supported study to explore our shared question, which is how might we make curriculum for the new computer science principles course more accessible for students with learning and attention disorders. And we're working on this together because, you know, we truly believe that to begin to be able to answer some of these kind of practical problems, we need to have this type of collaboration across the areas of expertise that we can bring to the table. So, you know, our question really stems from the knowledge that high school computer science education, and particularly the computer science principles course, you know, is really new to the K-12 scene right now. And so there are few, if any, resources out there that are specifically designed to provide teachers with guidance about ways to support some of the many students who we want to have in CS, who we consider to be underrepresented. So we're happy that we have some time with you today so that we can share some of these resources that we've been able to create out of this exploratory work that we've been doing that are specific to mobile CSP curriculum. So we're going to use our time today to provide kind of a brief overview of who we mean when we talk about students who learn differently. We'll also walk you through the mobile CSP lesson 3.2 paint pot tutorial, which is one that we reviewed and wrote up some recommendations specific to the ways that teachers can adjust certain parts of the lesson to kind of improve accessibility for students who learn differently. And then finally, we're going to point you to some other resources that we have to help you kind of take a similar approach as part of your computer science lesson planning. So as we start to talk, just so that we're all on the same page about who we're specifically referring to and why, when we say students who learn differently, in our project we're really referring to students with specific learning disabilities in areas like reading, written expression, math, and language, as well as students who have related attention disorders like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or ADHD. And in both of these cases, these are students who have psychological processing deficits that contribute to academic challenges with classroom activities. And we're talking about them because this is a significant population of students. So 1 in 5 students in the US have learning and attention disorders. And in fact, these students make up the largest group of all students who receive special education services under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. So there are a good number of students who as well, who are receiving kind of services both for learning disabilities and ADHD. And many of these students spend a significant portion of their time in mainstream classrooms. So many of them spend 80% of their day in general education classrooms, which means they will be, and we want them to be in our computer science classes too. Yet these students in general who have disabilities are underrepresented in STEM and also in currently in advanced placement courses. So our work to kind of help make computer science principles more welcoming and accessible to these particular students, we've done this work across our teams of research and practice to really start to take what's known about practices that support students who learn differently in other disciplines, combine that, with the great expertise of the learning specialists on our team, our education researchers, and begin to identify places in computer science principles. In our project, we specifically, initially we're working with the code.org version of it, and identifying places where teachers can kind of points where they can make sections of lessons a better fit for a wider range of students. So we then were able to do some pilot testing in our initial work of some of our alternate strategies to kind of inform some of the revisions that we wanted to make to what we had written. And the reason why, I'll just point out the reason why that we initially started work with code.org was because that we left it up to our teacher partner what she wanted to use when she taught the course last year, and that was the curriculum that she selected. So out of that process and kind of structure that we created for that initial work, we've now been able to use the same kind of approach to identify places in a handful of mobile CSP lessons where we've been able to provide teachers with some recommendations about strategies that they can use to adjust lesson components to make them more accessible for students with learning disabilities and attention deficit disorders. All right, so I know that there's a lot of information on this screen, but I wanted to share with you, so as I'm talking about kind of like alternate strategies, I'm specifically referring to two types of adjustments that we identified, that we kind of wrote to be used at various points in lessons. So the first one is adaptations, and these are, simple adjustments teachers can make for the entire class, so something that everybody in the room is going to experience. And then we also have what we call accommodations, which is likely a term that's familiar to teachers. And these are additional adjustments that can be made for individual students who need support beyond what we recommend in terms of the whole class adjustments. The other layer of that is, of course, to keep in mind that students who actually do have some type of an IEP or 504, they're also going to have their specific set of required accommodations that a teacher is going to need to make in addition to these. But some of our accommodations are similar, and they're going to benefit a wide range of students. So in terms of the range of kind of like learning and attention disorders that we consider in our work, to identify kind of some of these places that might be tricky for those students in lessons as written, I have some tables here for you. So on the left-hand side is a range of broad disorders and sub-disorders associated with each of those kind of like larger categories. So for example, you have reading there, and that is really, in many cases specific to aspects of decoding or fluency or comprehension. And attention, you can see there, that can be about, a student may experience, have difficulty with attentiveness or hyperactivity, or in some cases a combination of both. So those are the kind of the main, when we're thinking about broad categories, disability disorder categories, and the subcomponents of those on the left. On the right then, so this table shows a range of psychological processes that are kind of underlying these disorders where students can experience deficits, and we considered these as well as we were doing our work, writing lesson adjustments, because even among students who maybe have a similar kind of like formal diagnosis, say in language, the characteristics of the disorder can vary and present in different ways in different students, because those students are still going to have different combinations of areas where they have strengths and areas where they have weaknesses in some of these types of processes. So, the other thing to keep in mind is that just within the normal range of the human population, all of us have different areas within these psychological processes where we have strengths and we have weaknesses. And so any classroom is going to be made up of kind of a wide range of students who have strengths in some areas and not as strong in other areas. And because these types of disorders, because of those disorders that we just looked at, some students can struggle with any number of, regular classroom tasks or activities that you would find in a CS class or that you might find in any type of class. So, for example, on the left here, these are a few types of tasks or activities that may be challenging for some students who have language disorders. So, for example, something where related to vocabulary, comprehending, recalling, or retrieving new terminology, really comprehending discussion prompts, processing, retaining information presented verbally when there aren't any visual supports for them. So there are, a range of things that can be a challenge for students who have a disorder related to language. Another example on the right, so these are some examples of activities that can be tricky for students with attention and executive functioning issues, things like maintaining focus and attention while they're watching videos, or during co-class discussions, or even peer-to-peer conversations, completing work because it requires them to concentrate, breaking down larger tasks into smaller steps, those types of things. So those are things that we're, thinking about as we're looking at different types of segments of lessons and thinking about where there may be some places that can be a challenge for a student. So before I hand things over to my colleague Daphne, I wanted to just walk you through a little bit the specific kind of share some of the format that we use. There's all these things that I just talked about that we're thinking about, and identifying places in lessons, and how we're kind of writing up some recommendations. So I just wanted to share this with you so you have this framing. But as I mentioned earlier, we reviewed lessons with an eye for spots in lessons that would maybe potentially be a barrier for students who learn differently. And so as our way to communicate with each other and to teachers we're working with, we identified where those are. So you can see here we have a section where it's talking about what's the lesson section that it's related to. We also wanted to concretely kind of identify the task itself that for us stood out as a place that might be a potential barrier. So what exactly is the task that a student, or the ask that a student is being required to do? And then what are some of the difficulties that particular type of activity or task might pose for some students? Below that, you can see where we have kind of some of these whole class accommodation, adjustment recommendations, the adaptations, things that we suggest that a teacher could potentially do at that point in the lesson in place of what's there or in addition to it to make it more accessible. And in some cases, we also then have suggestions for accommodations that can be provided to individual students to provide some additional support that they might need. So with that, I'm actually going to hand things over to Daphne, and she's going to give you some very specific examples of things that she created specific to the Paint Pot Tutorial 3.2 lesson.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to walk you through about, like, I guess 5 sort of points in the lesson. Just wanted to highlight I felt like needed some adjustments to meet the needs, of students who learn differently. And overall, like I would say, the students are bright, and a lot of times just need things to be said explicitly. That I think that a lot of us, if we don't experience challenges in those areas, need those to be made like very explicit. And so what I will do is I kind of walk you through suggestions that were made, and you'll see sort of like in some of the boxes, you'll see what's been pulled out are the suggestions that are like part of like the complete sheet. So if you see here, it says like lesson section, and within the teacher materials, we're talking about a hook or like a motivation. That's what it was categorized as. And here the teacher is going to lead the students in a discussion, on the Snapchat, app. So they're basically going to discuss, Snapchat, what are the components of the app. So if you read the hook here, that's like the teacher is supposed to sort of basically say to the student, it says, ask the students if they've used this Snapchat app, have them brainstorm the user interface components and the functionality needed to draw on the picture. Okay, so just that in itself, like just by using like that type of language, like while you're introducing something, for some students can be, pretty challenging. Like, so some students may just have trouble really just understanding, that prompt, like the use of like interface components. They may not quite know what that means, or even like functionality, even though they may have heard it, but just like in that context, it may not make sense to them. And then just while they're having discussion, like some students have trouble like just recalling or retrieving information. It doesn't mean that they don't know it. It's just that some people experience it like that tip of the tongue sensation, like where you're trying to remember someone's name, just try to remember like, a fact. And, and you're just like working at it, it's going to come to you eventually. Just that some people actually experience that like to a pretty significant degree. And so they might know it, they know what they want to say, it's just they're not finding the words. And again, just trouble expressing and articulating their thoughts. Some kids, in the language domain just really have trouble tying their thoughts together and doing so in a way that's like understood, by others. And then that could be compounded by the fact that like there might be other kids in the room who have attention issues and they're listening to someone who's having trouble, putting together, like they're listening to a classmate that's having trouble putting their thoughts together. And so it might take a little longer. And if you already have an attention issue, that in itself, just like listening to your classmates could be a challenge. And then a few kids may just have trouble using socially appropriate language for a variety of reasons. Like sometimes some kids know, like intuitively, like what should be said, appropriately in a situation, but they have trouble retrieving the right words. But some kids just may have trouble in the social domain, just like knowing how to phrase things appropriately or, not put someone down in a particular way, just because they have challenges in the social sort of skill domain. Okay, so next slide. So we're saying, for this case, what we could do, so we're not changing the whole lesson, just sort of emphasizing some things. And some teachers might find themselves like already doing these types of things already. And I would say like a lot of teachers do, but I would say like the intensity and the amount of times that probably needs to be done when working with, kids with learning differences it might just mean to be done like a lot more often. So for instance, check for understanding of discussion prompts. So if something's thrown out there, like really make sure before moving forward that students know what interface components mean and have some examples, before moving on, not just taking not just taking at face value if they confirm like, yes, I know what interface component means, like, checking and looking for examples. Making sure they know, they really know what it means. Then functionality, also clarifying understanding. And then these are also just like great opportunities to not only just clarify like your prompt, but just to make sure that students have a good working definition of terms that you're probably using in your class. A lot of kids with language issues have sort of like a surface level understanding of words, and they don't really know, they don't know like enough depth. So it's an opportunity to build that depth. Providing enough wait time for them to, come up with the answers before calling on them or as they're formulating their thoughts, like just giving them that pause. And then also creating a climate in the classroom, like where, students are given enough wait time, for each other, because some people just need a little more time. And I think in just in our society, like we could be a little impatient and just jump right in and start speaking for, each other. A good thing to do is like to rephrase and recap what students have said. So, if a student is struggling to put their thoughts together and it's coming out in a way that's not quite clear, pausing and, saying like, here, I heard, John say, and then maybe like tying it together and saying it in a succinct way, that will help the kids who maybe have listening comprehension challenges already, but now they're listening to a classmate that may not be putting their thoughts together very well. And then throughout the discussion, just help model phrasing by using, socially appropriate language, content, like content appropriate language. There's times where you can model. There might be times where you may have to like explicitly state like rules, like, the classroom, about how we're going to like listen to each other and, explain and model, how to disagree with what someone's saying, for instance. Okay, next slide. All right. And so moving on to like the meat of the lesson here, like in, this section sort of highlights something that's found in the student materials. There the students viewed 2 videos. And the first introduces like the painting, drawing canvas. I think it's what's blocked here. And its related handlers. And the second video introduces the concepts of like dot size and shows them how to like increment and like how to increase and decrease the dot size. and also introduces data abstraction. So the students are asked to open the App Inventor environment, in a different window, and then move between the video and the instruction materials back to the App Inventor. So like for kids with some memory issues like that in itself could be a challenge, just like moving back and forth. So here I propose that, just understand the instructions and the terminology in the video. Be challenging, especially if, complex instructions are used. Again, moving between the two windows of the computer, would just be really hard. Like you're getting instructions one place, and then you have to like retain it, and then, act on it in another sort of window. And then recalling, understanding, and applying mathematical concepts. So the idea of coordinates is used, as well as like radii. So some kids just might need refreshers. Some might seem like, oh, this is something that everybody knows, or I know they just did this in their math class like last week. You may want to just check and make sure, one, students recall it, and two, understand how it applies here, or that we're talking about the same thing. Because sometimes kids might see things like it's kind of like in silos and don't necessarily see how these things translate, to a different environment. And then also just identifying using the block commands and variables, particularly in the second video, because their features, their names, and how they relate to one another are presented in a really, quick and sort of like visually dense way. We can move on to the next one. Okay, so one suggestion, that works here and can work in other scenarios is to actually project the instructional video like on a screen so that the whole class can see it, and then the students themselves then have like the App Inventor, so I guess open up on their computer, so that way they don't have to move back and forth. And then if the whole class views the video, the teacher can pause and explain and replay, and then the students therefore don't have to sort of like take on all the instruction and all on their own, like take it in on their own, comprehend it on their own, and then move back and forth. Another thing that that needs to be done quite often is for some kids with visual spatial issues, just really highlighting the differences between the blocks. It's like while they're projected, like really guiding their eyes to like see like how they differ and why some might fit well with others. I think, the blocks were intentionally designed that way to make it provide cues visually to the user. But for some kids, they may not necessarily automatically pick up on that. So if you're saying that, these, it's like you're feeling like it's pretty obvious that these two blocks go together, or this variable always pops in here, some kids may not see that. They might need to be pointed out, like this is, how this is oval over here, this is going to fit in this section. And then, so that would be for the whole class. And individually, you might find that you have to review the concept of coordinates. Have to like back up a little bit, make sure they understand that, and then see how that translates to what you're doing here. And the same thing with the idea of radius. And then if the kids are going to be using the instructions, on their own, or like reading what's like in the student materials on their own, allowing them to use like text-to-speech software that's often built into computers, the idea that you could highlight the text and it reads it back to you, or walk around the class and read certain things back to students who may have trouble reading on their own. Okay, next one. All right, so in this one, like again in the student materials, they're guided through understanding how the App Inventor blocks, translate to like the AP pseudocode. So specifically this one, like the initialized global variable block, and the set block and the get block. So there's a lot of text there, and just sort of like seeing the connection between like the two types of blocks, could be pretty challenging. So reading and comprehending the terminology, and then really being able to pick up how these two translate to the pseudocode. And again, this idea of the math components, like we were talking about, dot sizes that sort of adjust based on the radii. So that might also be a challenge. And you might find that if there's, a couple days, if there's a day between like the two lessons, for someone who has like significant math challenges, you might find that you're like basically repeating the same things you did like a couple days ago or just the day before, but just want to solidify that. Okay, we can move on. Okay. So this one is, so one suggestion for the whole class is provide a list of, of all the learn block codes, their labels, their variables, and then like really sort of connecting it to the app, the AP pseudocode, just making sure that they understand, and highlighting how like the commands they've learned, the app inventor, connects to the AP pseudocode. And just really spending time with the students, like reading through the list, provide additional explanations, check for understanding. Some of these things might seem intuitive, might seem that it's like pretty like obvious, but some kids may really need to have that broken down. I would say just based on the population we have at our school, I would see that a good number of them probably need to make that association explicit. So by simplifying it, kind of like in your own sort of reference sheet, and really highlighting the differences, with the group would be great. And then for some kids, they might just need additional, guidance, individual guidance, who have difficulty working through the code, examples that involve mathematical concepts. And again, reading parts of the written explanation of how the app inventor blocks translate the AP pseudocode. So again, just this is more of like, once you get the whole group going, you've kind of done your whole, sort of group instruction, how these two connect. You might find that some kids, might need you to circulate and work with them individually and have them you might have to actually read certain parts aloud. Okay. Move on to the next one. Okay, so this one, the students read and respond to multiple choice questions, and then they're able to receive immediate feedback on the responses to the multiple choice questions, and they're also asked to respond to 2 reflection questions. So, some students may have trouble reading and comprehending the questions and the explanations, of what, why, one answer was correct and one was incorrect. Because this one, when you respond to the questions, box pops up and sort of explains why your answer was wrong or right. And they're just recalling all the newly learned terminology, understanding explanations, again, recalling and using the mathematical concepts, and then putting their own thoughts into words. So same students who may have trouble verbally explaining themselves, in a group discussion may also face the same challenges when they're asked to write. So just they have all these thoughts and, finding the right words, that same tip of the tongue sensation can happen as, when you're writing as well. And then just knowing how to phrase your thoughts can be challenging. And then just typing or handwriting responses will be challenging. Like for some kids, the motor component of handwriting is hard, but also typing. It might translate also into the typing. Okay, so for individual suggestions here, offer the students, text-to-speech software so they could read and reread questions. You can read some of the questions out loud, circulate in the room and read some of the questions out loud, check for understanding, clarify. Again, assist the students who have difficulty with math concepts. You might find yourself, if you made a reference material for them at some point in time, maybe like pulling it out, right at the time of the test, make sure they can review them. Again, you could assist students who have difficulty putting the thoughts into words. You can cue, you can model. What's really, been helpful is if you could actually give them like sentence stems, help them start their sentences. Sometimes give them the terminology they're looking for. And then for some kids, the opportunity to use dictation software would be helpful. So if they have to type up the answers and that motor component is challenging enough, they can dictate. And then dictation software can also be useful if kids have trouble with spelling. They can state the word and then dictation software will most likely recognize it. And then you don't have to worry about spelling being a challenge as much. All right, and then the next one. So the last section here is the teacher materials is highlighted there, the Rethink, Reflect, and Revise. So the teacher leads students in discussion regarding the new language elements in PaintPod. And so they're asked to raise questions and describe the event handling, situations that occurred. So again, similar to the beginning, just understanding the teacher's prompts, recalling and retrieving information. Same thing here, basically. These type of things will be sort of common in all sort of group discussions. expressing themselves, sustaining attention while others explain themselves in ways that may not be easy to understand or might take longer, and then using socially appropriate language. So the suggestions would probably be very similar to the initial one. So you want to check for understanding, clarify and rephrase. If there's a lot of content being discussed, like especially like a final discussion like this, you might want to project the key points and terminology from the lesson, just so that, it's present, and, you could highlight those. So you're providing like a visual reinforcement to this like review of the content, allowing enough wait time for to the students, and again, helping them to rephrase and recap for others, and then to continue modeling phrasing. So I think that's it for that. Mm-hmm.
So that's it. So, the other thing that a few things I wanted to point out. So as Daphne was saying in that last one there are some of these things that just kind of continue to pop up, right? So in many cases, you're going to have students who are going to have challenges related to language or social interactions or reading or writing. And so some of these things that we've suggested, they're probably things that some of you are already doing in your classroom, because in one way, many of these things they're just good teaching and learning practices for any student. And certainly these are things that are essential when you're talking about students who have diagnosed differences as well, because those challenges that any range of students could experience are intensified, magnified for students who have diagnosed differences. So we think that there are probably some things that you're already doing in your classroom. We also wanted to note that we were able to look at a few other mobile CSP lessons as well. And so I've listed some of these on the screen here. And as we were looking at these, we were mostly kind of looking for some of those activities that tend to continually pop up in different types of lessons. So many of the recommendations that we provide in the lessons that you see here are related to things such as collaboration, reading, writing, language. So those things that you're going to find in any computer science classroom. So there are some other recommendations that we have, and Jen can probably talk a little bit more about actually what that means for you in terms of if you will see those or if they'll be somewhere else, how that will work. But, we wanted to let you know that we have looked at a number of other things as well, and made some recommendations. So, I think one of the big takeaways here is that once we are kind of aware of some of the different types of challenges that students may encounter in the computer science principles course, we can certainly then be proactive and kind of think about those things and proactively plan to account for them in doing lesson planning, and coming up with some alternate strategies that are going to help support students kind of navigate around some of these challenges, whether they're things that are, again, what we were calling adaptations, things that can be adjusted for the whole class to experience, or if they're going to be things that when you just have a few, subset of students who are going to have some challenges with reading or writing or language, some additional supports that you can provide for them along the way. Because the main idea is that we're all working to make sure that all students have the same opportunities in computer science, and some of those students who we want to be there are going to have a few additional challenges that we need to figure out how we can provide some support for them. So while we didn't talk about any of this today, I also just wanted to let you know that our project has a website where we have a few other additional resources that may be of interest to you. And some of these resources are related to just some general strategies that can be used in the computer science classroom for thinking about potential barriers. We also spent a lot of time, at least on the researcher side, the outlier side, we spent a lot of time talking directly with the students who were in the computer science principles course that was taught last year, so that we could better understand what their experience was in the class throughout the duration, where they were kind of experiencing some challenges, what types of suggestions they would give to another teacher for kind of helping them get around some of those barriers. And so that allowed us to kind of create these what we're calling student voices resource pages, which I don't think Daphne has even seen these yet, but they're brand new. But anyway, there's an example of what one looks like on the right there. And so this is where we've done a little bit of work to kind of take what we heard the students saying about things that they, places where they encountered some barriers, some challenges, synthesizing some of that, and then also providing some targeted kind of recommendations based on some of the work that we had done in our exploratory study. So, you can check those things out too. We have a number of them related to programming, reading, many of the things that Daphne already talked about. But again, this idea is, it's mostly that, we want to think about how we can be proactive and identify some resources, some strategies, some things that we can consider as we're prepping for the computer science classroom. And that's all that Daphne and I have in terms of a formal presentation. So if there is a little bit of time, we'd be happy to answer any questions. I know, Jen, you had some questions about vocabulary. We're happy to chat.
Great. Thank you so much, Daphne and Sarah, for presenting. I did want to just say to the Mobile CSP teachers listening that the agenda has the example for, a number of the strategies that Sarah and Daphne shared with us linked in there, but I will be adding to the Teach Unit 10 where it has the pedagogy on supporting students with learning differences, the other documents that they shared for the other lessons there, so that if you're looking for those materials, you'll just want to go to the pedagogy unit and take a look at those. And then the other piece is that as we revise the curriculum and make updates for the next year, for the 2018-2019 academic year, we're trying to, take this lens as we go through the student and teacher materials and make sure that we're doing, a good job of providing reminders to you when you need to reinforce some vocabulary pieces, and then providing some support structures right on the student materials page, so that hopefully that'll be a little bit easier. So even if you go to the Paint Pot page now, you'll see that Beryl has put in a table with the pseudocode from the AP pseudocode and the App Inventor blocks aside, so that you can see those and students can see those right away. So,
Yay.
Yeah. So hopefully you'll see those, those adjustments trickle throughout the lessons here over the summer. But I will open it up to general questions. Everybody is welcome to unmute themselves and ask questions at this point. So, and I'll just stop the recording, so you can feel free to ask questions without fear of having it preserved forever.